Hello. So, moving on from the last video, which was about getting Python working in Visual Studio Code. This one is kind of a bit of a part two. Basically, this is now connecting Python to SQL Server using Visual Studio Code. Now, because we're SQL people, we are SQL people. Yes, this is a Python video, but we are SQL people. So therefore, the majority of the stuff I will do with Python is actually interacting with SQL Server. It's getting the data out, then doing something with it, then pushing the data back to SQL Server again, so that we've kind of got logs here and there, and letting kind of Python do the clever stuff in between. So this is basically just using Visual Studio Code and Python in order to get data in and out of SQL Server in just a nice, easy way. So it's kind of a follow-on, like I said, from the last video. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a test.py file, so just a nice Python file. Now, in my last video, I did at the end do a pip install pyodbc. We're going to need the Python ODBC library in order to actually run this. So if you haven't seen the previous video, go watch it. But otherwise, if you do just want to kind of carry on from here, then you can, I'm just going to boot the terminal. You can just do a pip install of pyodbc. Mine is obviously going to say that it is already there, so it's going to say requirement already met. That's fine because it's already installed on mine. On yours, if you don't have it, it will then install. So now we've got that installed, what we're going to do is import pyodbc. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a connection using pyodbc. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically say, okay, we're going to use the SQL Server driver. And we are going to, I'm going to put this over here, connect to my server equals most tavern because Simpsons. And then we're going to have database equals testdb. And I am going to do trusted connection equals yes. Okay, so that in a nutshell is how you would use pyodbc to connect to a SQL server. So that will now connect to my SQL server. Now obviously we want to kind of get data out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a cursor. And what I'm going to do is basically use the connection to create me a cursor. And then in that, I'm going to compute some SQL. So I'm just going to do select database ID and name from sys.databases, nice and simple. So once that's loaded into the cursor, what we're going to do is loop through the cursor. So we're just going to do for each row in cursor, and I'm just going to print out the row. Now, that will therefore connect to my SQL server. It will run that query, it will load it into a cursor, and then row by row it's just going to print it out to the screen. So if I run this, you'll see that's exactly what happens, and we actually get our results printed row by row out to the screen. Simple. So that's kind of how we can connect to a SQL server and read data from it. A good way of getting data into Python. However, from a SQL perspective, I don't like this. I mean, like I said, we're SQL Server experts, this is what we do. So generally I don't like working with cursors and row by row stuff. So I actually want to kind of get it like you would in C# when you pull it into a data set, and even in PowerShell I tend to create a data set using like .NET Framework libraries, and I kind of want to do the same in Python. I want to put it into a data set. Now in Python we do have data frames, we just need to use the pandas library. To use the pandas library, same as anything else, you pip install it. So we're going to pip install pandas. It takes a couple of minutes. On mine it's already installed, so it's going to be instant. On yours, if it's the first time, it will take a while because pandas actually installs a lot of other libraries along with it. So you can see here dateutil, numpy, 6, etc. So it's going to do that. I'm going to clear the screen because that gets a bit cluttered after a while. So now I'm going to import my pandas as p. Now, just as a note for any other SQL people out there, when you import, you can actually allocate it kind of like an alias like you would in SQL Server. So if you're doing select star from table as T, and then you want to use the columns T dot column 1, T dot column 2, etc. You're just aliasing it with the as T. It's exactly the same as you're doing here. So you can see I've imported a library and I've aliased it as P. So from now on I can do P dot. So for this one you could see I had to use the full PYDBC. From now on when I use the pandas library I just need P. So just to use that, what I'm now going to do is I'm basically going to do P dot, and I'm going to do a read SQL query, and then I'm just going to put in the query I want to do. So I'm just going to do database ID and name from sys.databases, and I'm going to use the connection that we listed above. Now this will actually return a data frame, which is basically a data set. So it's going to return a data frame. So I'm going to create a variable that it's just going to assign. So it's going to create that as a data frame and populate it. So I can then print my data frame out to the terminal. So if I run this, you'll see we've now got what looks like a table, which is great because as a SQL guy, I'm much happier using tables. So this to me looks nicer. I can actually work with this. There is a weird quirk which you can actually see at the front here where it's actually allocated it a kind of zero based ID. That just gets created by default in a data frame. It will cause you problems later on. We're going to see how it causes the problems and kind of how to avoid them. It's not major in any way, shape or form. It's just useful to know because otherwise it can be a bit of a kind of shock when you kind of go, why has it done that? And you don't know how to deal with it. So we now basically have our data in a table in Python. We would now obviously do stuff to it, but all I'm going to do is pass it straight back out to SQL Server. So in order to do that, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create myself a Python test.sql. So I'm going to create myself a python.test SQL, and I'm just going to use testdb go. Now I'm just going to run this so that it will actually just connect to my server. You can see it just kind of pulls up the connection, so that's fine. And then I'm going to do drop table if exists Python import, and then I am just going to create table with Python import. IntelliSense, I'm not used to it yet. So we're going to do our database ID, which is going to be an int, and we're going to do our DB name, which is going to be a varchar 100. Now, the way I've created this table is going to cause us problems, but I kind of like that because it's kind of a teachable thing. So I'm going to leave it like this. And what I'm going to do is just run this now so that we kind of create this table in our system. Yep, good, fine. I'm also going to create another, which is just going to be called pythoncheck.sql. And I'm going to bung this over here. And this is just going to be a use testdb, and it's just going to do a select star from Python import. Okay. And then if I run that, it's going to ask me to connect, and then it's just going to run and show that we've got an empty table. Now this is just so that I've got a flow again, so I've kind of created my table. I'm going to do the Python, then I'm going to check on it. So it saves you again, like I said in one of my previous videos about using Visual Studio Code as dev flow. I find this so much easier. Instead of having to go to SQL Server, different tabs in SQL Server, go back to a command window, go to somewhere else, do this, do that, just to actually have all the tabs in one place is just amazing. So I've created my blank table. We've seen that it's blank. This is now the bit in the middle that's going to actually get me some data and then pump it back into SQL Server. So we've now created our data frame. So now what we need to do is push it back. Now to push it back, there is another library that we're going to need, and this one is called SQL Alchemy. So down here in our terminal, we're just going to do install SQL Alchemy. Again, mine's already installed, so requirement already met. And I'm just going to clear my terminal. So I can now use this. Now, I only want a small portion of it, so I'm just going to basically say from SQL Alchemy import create engine. Okay, so this is just another way of getting something out of a library. So from my library, just import this bit. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of printing this out, I'm basically going to create myself an engine. And in order to do this, I'm now going to do create engine. Now at this point I am actually going to go and copy this from a different window, because I will admit this is a bit of a pain. What you basically have to do is you have to say, I'm using Microsoft SQL alongside PyODBC. This is the server I'm going to. This is the database I'm going to. I'm using trusted connection, so Windows. And this is the driver I want you to use in order to do this. Okay, it's a bit of a pain, it's a bit quirky, but once you've done it, obviously it's just a copy and paste job. I mean, I don't like the fact that the server is split from the database by a slash, and then you've got a question mark between that and the authentication. I just find it weird. But this is the syntax, this is what we use, and copy pastable, and it works. Now the only quirk here is, depending on what version of SQL Server you have installed, this ODBC driver may not be the right one for you. Okay, so I'm going to show you now that this is going to collapse horribly, just because it's fun to see errors and actually see how you get around them, because I don't happen to have driver 13 for SQL Server. That's a much older version. I only have SQL 2019 installed on this box, so I'm on a much different version number to this, but I'll show you what happens when it goes wrong. So now we've got our engine. What we're basically now going to do is just say, okay, what I want to do is I want to take my data frame and I want to push it to SQL, and I want to put it into my Python import table, okay, using the engine that we've just created. And what I'm going to put on is a little thing that just says, if exists, I want you to append the data. Okay, so that's fine. So that all looks good. Okay, so what we're doing is we're getting a connection in order to get our data frame. We're then generating an engine in order to push our data back. And we're basically saying, push it back into this table, please. Now this, in theory, should work. It's actually going to go wrong. And I will show you it going wrong just to kind of show this weird driver thing. Just to basically show you that you need the correct driver for your system, and then I'll show you how to kind of find it. So when I press play on this, we're going to get kind of a whole ream of errors. Well, actually just a nice simple error, because I've missed off a bracket or added one. There you go. It's nice. See, unmatched bracket. It's fun when things go wrong that you don't expect to go wrong. So now we should hopefully, there we go. This is what I expected. We now have a whole ream of stuff here, basically just saying data source name not found, no default driver. Okay, but I've specified a driver, so obviously it hasn't found the driver I was looking for. So I've just got a whole ream of errors, which is obviously not what you want. So what you actually need to do is just go to your start thing and just type ODBC, open that up, and what you'll get in here is, if you go over to drivers, down here you'll actually see I have ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server, because mine, like I said, is a much more recent SQL Server install. So I actually have driver 17, not driver 13. So if I change this to 17, now if I run this, we'll actually get some more success, but I'm still hoping that we'll get some sort of failure. Good. Now, we no longer have the driver issue. Okay. What we now have down here is invalid column name, name. Okay. Now, this is one of the issues that we're going to come up with, is that when it says it's trying to insert into Python import, and it's trying to insert using the exact headers from the data frame. Okay, now I named this DB name, okay, not name. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to say, okay, I need this to match exactly with what I'm pulling out of my query. So I'm going to rerun this. This also highlights the advantage of a data flow, just being able to click between tabs. So I've now rerun that. So now I can go back here and go, okay, now does it align? I mean, it still won't, but there's a different reason. Basically, because if you look here, it's actually trying to put 3 columns into our table, but our table only has 2 columns. And that's because, if you remember, our data frame had that 0 indexed column at the start that we weren't expecting, because we don't pull it back. That's actually something the data frame itself will add automatically in the background. So what you want to do here is basically just say index equals false. False. I don't want it to use the index. Okay, so when I do my push to SQL to that table using the engine, I don't want the index involved. Okay, so now I'm just going to clear down this screen. So now if I run this, then it works. Okay, now I can go to my Python check script, run this, and you'll see now up here we have data in our table exactly as we expected. Okay, so now if I did want to change things and say, actually, I want this to be database ID, and I actually do want this to be DB name. Okay, so this is the table I want to put it into. Okay, I've now created that. Now go back to my Python script. All I need to do is change my SQL to just say as database ID and this as DB name. And that's how it will then show up in the data frame. Okay, and then again, index false, run this, that will succeed, nice and fine. We go back here, run this again, and we've now got our table with our correct names populated exactly as we wanted it populating. Okay, so again, data flow, really handy because you can just go through going, I want to adjust the table, adjust the Python, check the result, all is good. And the key part is basically the Python bit of getting data in and out of SQL Server, okay, which is basically this. So what I do want to mention is this is more complicated than when I did it in PowerShell. Okay, PowerShell has invoke SQL command. You can literally just say get me data, push my data. Okay, it's a lot easier. But that's fine because PowerShell, the reason we have it is because we're generally automating tasks. So we kind of want to just pull data from a SQL server, push data to another. We're monitoring, we're collecting, we're gathering, we're just moving data around. We're not really doing anything with it. Okay, so PowerShell should be easy. It's an automation tool. Python, this is not designed to be an automation. I mean, don't go replacing that PowerShell script with this. That would be madness. With Python, we're looking to analyze. I mean, we all know that Python does machine learning. It does a lot of funky things. It's a full-on programming language. I mean, you know, you could get data from SQL Server, use it to go and screen scrape through an API into a website and actually just pull out reams of data, pull it back, use what you collected in SQL Server to manipulate that somehow, create something, throw it back to SQL Server, or in a more simplistic way, just get the data out of SQL, analyze it, find the outliers, return just the outliers to SQL Server, or just strip out the outliers and return just the data we want back to SQL Server for, you know, storage or whatever. You can actually get Python to do clever things. So for this to be a bit more complicated, I don't mind, because Python's there to be more complicated. But actually, in essence, if you look at this and reproduce it, it's not that bad. All you've now got to do is basically do all of your Python stuff here, the clever things, and then just throw your data set back out at the end. And that's how you can easily interact between SQL Server and Python. So there you go. That's basically all I wanted to show. I might at some point do a video actually showing some of the clever stuff Python can do in the middle, but that's for a later thing. For the moment, this was just get data and push it back. So like I said, hopefully that was helpful. As always, if you did like it, then like it and subscribe. Go to our website, qtech.co.uk. We've got hundreds of blogs, 250 plus SQL Server blogs alone, because we are SQL Server specialists, even though this was Python. And yeah, go check that out. Check all our other videos out. And yeah, hopefully it was useful. See you later.